The Roses of Death. Chapter 1, Roses, Ribbon, and a Man in the Cold Room. The morning of Saturday, May 8th, broke clear and brisk over the village of Much Benham. Spring sunshine polished the cobblestones until they gleamed, and the high street hummed with the purposeful rhythm of market day. Housewives hurried with baskets, children lingered at the sweet shop window, and the chatter of business rolled easily from one storefront to the next. On the corner, Pritchard and Posey, the village's pride and joy of a flower shop, caught the light with its wide glass frontage. Inside, rows of tulips, roses, and lilies stood in military order, their colors vivid against polished buckets, each bloom fresh from the dawn market 12 miles away. Behind the counter, Mrs. Ivy Pritchard moved with brisk precision. In her mid-40s, with gray hair tucked into a practical bun and hands as capable as any gardener's, she was the sort of woman whose self-possession spoke of private loss weathered with courage. Her late husband's absence still lingered in the dignified restraint of her movements. "Nell," she called to her niece, who was adjusting a spray of white roses near the window. "Mind how you handle those stems." Lady Bantry insisted there mustn't be a blemish on a single petal. "Yes, Aunt Ivy," Nell replied, her quiet smile lighting a face that was more gentle than striking, but no less lovely for it. Barely 22, she had a natural grace with ribbon and wire that could transform flowers into something more than decoration. The roses were for that evening's Founders' Ball, a centennial celebration for the Much Benham Horticultural Society. In this little village, it was the social event of the season, and the preparations carried a sense of military urgency. The shop bell rang, and Felix Hartley entered with the air of a man who expected his presence to command attention. At 50, his shoulders still carried the memory of school rugby, though softened by years of comfortable living. Chairman of the Horticultural Society and owner of the most prominent estate agency in town, he was accustomed to having his way. "Good morning, Mrs. Pritchard," he said heartily, surveying the flowers as though he owned them. "Everything under control for this evening? We must have absolute perfection. The community's reputation rests upon it." Ivy's hands stilled for just a moment before she returned to trimming a stem. "The arrangements will be ready at 4 o'clock, Mr. Hartley, as agreed." "Splendid, splendid," Felix said, his eyes sweeping the shop with proprietorial confidence. Yet behind his smile, something sharpened, calculating, as though weighing advantage. The rear door banged open with a blast of fresh air. Stan Baxter, 18 and earnest as a puppy, came whistling in, his bicycle leaning against the alley wall, its basket already half filled with deliveries. "Morning, Mrs. Pritchard." "Mr. Hartley." His gaze flicked quickly toward Nell, and the smile that passed between them spoke of young affection, unspoken but obvious. "Stanley," Hartley replied, his tone edged with condescension. "I trust you'll take care today. No mistakes, no delays. This evening is far too important." "Stan's never let us down," Ivy answered firmly, her voice brooking no argument. The air cooled a degree, though the sun still streamed through the windows. Felix's smile didn't falter, but his eyes registered the rebuke. Before Ivy could add more, the bell chimed again. Ursula Hartley, Felix's wife, glided in, elegance personified. Pale blonde hair perfectly set, morning suit in flawless coordination, she exuded the practiced poise of a woman for whom appearances were as vital as breath. "Felix, darling," she said, in a tone both sweet and commanding. "You haven't forgotten my roses, have you? 12 long-stemmed reds. They must be perfect. Margaret Weatherby is dining with us, and you know how critical she can be." "Of course, my dear," Felix replied smoothly. Turning to Ivy, he added, "Mrs. Pritchard will show us her finest selection." Ivy nodded, leading him toward the glass-fronted cold room at the back. The chamber hummed softly, its carefully balanced temperature preserving the shop's most precious blooms. Inside, rows of roses stood like soldiers, deep crimson, blush pink, and pale ivory, their perfume so heavy it almost overwhelmed. Felix stepped inside, humming approval as he examined the buckets. "Yes, very fine indeed. Very fine. Jessica Fletcher arrived just then, the bell above the door tinkling as she stepped into the busy shop. A small posy for her goddaughter's confirmation was her errand, but her sharp eyes took in the bustle, the roses, the ribbons, the tension hanging almost invisibly in the air. She smiled politely at Nell, who hurried over to assist, but her attention lingered briefly on the cold room door as Ivy pulled it nearly shut behind Hartley. An hour later, Stan returned from his deliveries, reaching automatically for the cold room handle. He stopped. "That's strange," he muttered. "Mrs. Pritchard, the door's latched, from the inside." Ivy's face drained of color. "Latched? But that's impossible. Mr. Hartley's been in there all this time." The shop fell silent, save for the low hum of the cold room motor. Jessica Fletcher set down the lilacs she'd been examining, her expression sharpening with quiet alertness. Stan shoved against the door. "It won't budge." Ivy hurried forward, knocking sharply on the glass. "Mr. Hartley? Are you all right?" There was no answer. Only still roses, their perfect blooms staring back through the fogged glass. When Stan finally forced the latch with the spare key, the sight that greeted them froze the room in horrified silence. Felix Hartley lay crumpled among the roses, crimson petals scattered across his dark coat like a grotesque parody of wedding confetti. His face was peaceful. His body unmistakably still. And Jessica Fletcher, crime novelist and unwilling witness, knew in that instant that this was no accident. Chapter 2, The Cooler Door That Latched Itself. The shock of Felix Hartley's body lying among the roses had not yet faded when Ursula Hartley's cry broke the stillness. "Felix!" She pushed past Stan, her composure cracking as she tried to rush into the cold room. Jessica Fletcher caught her firmly by the arm. "Mrs. Hartley, please. Until the doctor arrives, it's better not to disturb anything." Her tone was calm, but there was steel in it. Ursula hesitated, trembling, then allowed herself to be drawn back. Jessica had seen grief turn chaotic in her time, and the last thing needed was more confusion. Dr. Haydock, summoned with admirable speed, arrived moments later. A seasoned country doctor in his 60s, he carried the kind of gravity that came from decades of delivering bad news. He knelt briefly inside the cold room, examining the body with quiet precision. When he straightened, he gave a slow shake of his head. "Heart failure, most likely," he pronounced. "These airless conditions can bring on an episode. Poor man may have collapsed before he could reach the latch." It was a tidy explanation. Too tidy, Jessica thought, watching him clean his spectacles. Inspector Slack arrived not long after, Stan having pedaled furiously to the station. He was a stout, brisk man, efficient but sometimes too quick to accept the first plausible answer. His sharp glance passed over Jessica with recognition. He knew her by reputation, Cabot Cove's famous mystery writer who too often found herself in the middle of real crime. "Right then," he said, clapping his hands as though beginning a lecture. "Let's have a proper look." He examined the cold room carefully. The chamber was small, 8 feet square, lined with shelves where buckets of roses stood in perfect rows. The latch was simple, a thumb catch on the inside, smooth handle on the outside. Slack frowned. Curious. Anyone inside could open it easily. But to secure it from out here? He tapped the doorframe with his pen. Not possible. Unless you had uncommonly long fingers, or a tool. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. She stepped closer, her attention caught not by the door but by the floor. Scattered among the petals lay a florist's card, ivory stock, folded neatly but with a sharp crease down its center. "Inspector," she said softly, holding it up, "you might take a look at this." Slack accepted it with a grunt. "A love note? To you, with love. Likely his wife's." "Perhaps," Jessica said, her voice thoughtful. "But notice how it's been folded, hard enough to leave a permanent line. That doesn't look like a note carried in someone's pocket. More like it was pressed against something rigid." Lady Bantry, standing nearby in her ever-regal purple, gave a sharp intake of breath. Good heavens! You don't think it's connected, Jessica? I think it's unusual, Jessica replied evenly. And I've learned not to ignore unusual things. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. There's something else. The floor shows signs of water, rose water, most likely, but it's been wiped up in a hurry. And that overturned bucket, odd. It suggests someone didn't want us to see what had been spilled. Inspector Slack bent down, rubbing his fingers over the damp streaks. His expression was grim. Someone tried to cover their tracks. The shop seemed to shrink with the weight of implication. Ivy Pritchard, pale but resolute, stood at her counter, her knuckles white against the scissors she gripped. Mr. Hartley came in to choose roses. That was all. He was alive when I shut the door. I heard nothing unusual afterward. Slack's sharp gaze moved from Ivy to Nell, who twisted a length of ribbon in nervous hands, and then to Stan, whose honest face looked stricken with worry. Inspector, Jessica interjected gently, may I ask, how long had Mr. Hartley been inside before he was found? Nearly an hour, Ivy whispered. Jessica considered that. A man as particular as Felix Hartley might take his time with roses, yes. But nearly an hour? In an 8-foot chamber thick with perfume? That was no ordinary errand. She glanced once more at the bent card in Slack's hand, the faint dampness still darkening the cold room floor, and the strangely heavy silence that seemed to linger in the air. Her instincts told her that Felix Hartley had not simply fallen victim to frailty. This was something else entirely. Chapter 3, Bronze on the Petal Edge. By the time Felix Hartley's body had been carried discreetly away under Dr. Haydock's supervision, the shop no longer looked like the cheerful flower emporium Jessica had first stepped into that morning. The roses remained, but the mood had shifted, the colors seemed too bright, the perfume almost cloying, as though beauty itself had turned heavy. Jessica lingered near the cold room, watching Ivy Pritchard attempt to steady herself by fussing over half-finished arrangements. The woman's hands were practiced, but Jessica could see the tremor in her fingers. Lady Bantry stayed close, her voice lowered. Jessica, I've known you long enough to recognize that look. You've noticed something. Jessica gave a faint, rueful smile. I've learned that when something feels wrong, it usually is. Take these flowers, for instance. She bent to pick up one of the roses that had spilled onto the damp floor earlier. It was a magnificent crimson bloom, but along the serrated edges of several petals ran an unusual sheen. Jessica tilted the blossom toward the light. See this? She asked. Lady Bantry peered over her shoulder. It looks bronzed. Almost burned. Exactly. Not the natural browning you'd expect from age or careless handling. This is something sharper, almost chemical. Dr. Haydock, overhearing, joined them. He took the rose, turning it carefully. You may be right, Mrs. Fletcher. This isn't simple wilting. It resembles what we'd call chemical edge burn. Sulfur compounds can do this. Sulfur? Lady Bantry repeated, startled. Jessica nodded. I've read about old gardening practices. Too much sulfur near delicate plants can scorch them. The odd thing is that these roses were stored in an immaculate cold room. Nothing about this place should produce damage like this. Across the shop, Ursula Hartley, her grief already hardening back into hauteur, caught the last of Jessica's words. Really, Mrs. Fletcher, you can't possibly be suggesting Ivy Pritchard's flowers are at fault. Everyone knows refrigeration dries petals a little. It's perfectly natural. Jessica's expression remained courteous but firm. Drying leaves a dull edge. These have a metallic discoloration. It tells me something happened to them that doesn't belong in ordinary storage. Ivy straightened, her dignity bruised but her voice steady. My roses are kept in the finest conditions. Temperature, humidity, air circulation, everything is maintained exactly. Her insistence carried conviction, but Jessica could hear the bewilderment underneath. That, more than her words, caught Jessica's attention. Nell, who had been quietly refilling water buckets, set down her jug. "Aunt Ivy, could something have gotten into the air system? I mean, if fumes or chemicals were circulating." The suggestion drew silence. Everyone seemed to feel the weight of the idea at once. Jessica carefully replaced the rose on the counter and spoke in her measured way. "If that's the case, Inspector, then we aren't looking at a heart attack brought on by chance. We're looking at a space someone deliberately prepared." Inspector Slack, who had been prowling the room with his notebook, gave a grunt of annoyance. "You mean sabotage? Poison fumes and scorched petals. It's starting to sound more like a blasted detective novel than a Saturday in Much Benham." Jessica folded her hands calmly. "And yet, Inspector, the facts remain: a locked door, a bent florist's card, a floor scrubbed in haste, and now roses with chemical burns. When details stack up, they stop being coincidence." The inspector gave her a long look, half irritation, half reluctant respect. He might not like her involvement, but even Slack knew better than to ignore Jessica Fletcher once she started piecing threads together. She glanced again at the petals. They glimmered faintly under the shop's lamps, bronzed like a warning written in the flowers themselves. And Jessica, ever alert to the small signs people overlooked, knew they were pointing towards something darker, something deliberate. Chapter 4, The Florist's Card Written Over. By late afternoon, the golden light pouring through Pritchard and Posey's wide windows should have made the shop look warm and inviting. Instead, it cast long, uneasy shadows across the counters. The Founders' Ball, the village's most anticipated event, was now an afterthought. All eyes remained fixed on the unanswered questions circling Felix Hartley's sudden death. Jessica Fletcher sat at one of the small work tables, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied the bent florist's card recovered from the cold room. Inspector Slack had humored her request not to bag it just yet, though he muttered about writers making mysteries out of stationery. The card was fine stock, the kind Ivy Pritchard prided herself on using. The message on it read simply, "To you, with love." Elegant, fluid script. Romantic, at first glance. But Jessica tilted the card against the light, her brow furrowing. "Not all of this belongs here," she murmured. Beneath the inked inscription, faint graphite markings emerged, letters and numbers, neatly arranged, practical rather than sentimental. Lady Bantry leaned in, her pearl earrings catching the light. "Well, Jessica? You've seen something." "It looks like a stock code," Jessica said. "The kind a shop would use to catalog supplies. Someone wrote a message over it, but the original markings weren't erased, just hidden." Ivy, hearing this, abandoned her half-tied bouquet and came closer. She stared at the card, genuine surprise widening her eyes. "That's not possible. We never use coded stock cards for customers. They're kept separate. Fresh cards only. Always." Ursula Hartley, her composure sharpened once more, interjected. "Surely this is making much of nothing. I requested roses, not espionage. Felix was particular, yes, but codes and notes. Utter nonsense." Jessica looked at her steadily. "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone chose that card precisely because it carried something extra." Nell Pritchard, who had been quietly sorting ribbon spools, spoke up hesitantly. "The inventory codes are marked on disposable tags. Aunt Ivy's strict about it. If this was used for a customer message, it didn't come from the regular tin." Inspector Slack finally joined them, his notebook in hand. He gave a short nod. "So, either it was taken from another part of the shop or brought in from elsewhere." Jessica tapped the sharp crease running through the center. "And folded over something. Maybe wire, maybe another flat object. The card wasn't just written on, it was used." Dr. Haydock, still tidying his notes from the medical examination, paused at Jessica's tone. He took the card, angling it carefully. She's right. The ink disturbed older graphite. And look here, the pressure marks. It was written on a flat surface, not in someone's hand. Jessica folded her arms, thoughtful. Which makes me wonder, why recycle a card when clean ones are right here? Unless you wanted to disguise what it was originally meant for. Silence settled. Even Slack didn't immediately dismiss the point. Ursula Hartley, breaking the tension, gave a sharp laugh that carried more strain than humor. It's absurd. Codes, chemicals, and now conspiracies with florists' cards. This is a flower shop, not a crime scene. Jessica slipped the card back across the counter, her voice calm but steady. With respect, Mrs. Hartley, it is a crime scene. And small details, like what someone writes on or throws away, have a way of telling truths the people themselves won't. She saw Ivy flinch slightly, though the florist quickly masked it with a professional air. Jessica filed that reaction away, the way she always did. The bronzed petals, the impossible latch, the scrubbed floor, and now a card carrying two stories, one visible, one hidden. Individually, each was curious. Together, they whispered of careful planning. And Jessica Fletcher had learned long ago that whispered details often shouted the loudest when murder was involved. Chapter 5, The Bucket That Smelled of Matches. Inspector Slack had ordered the rear rooms of the shop to be searched. It wasn't just routine anymore, too many small details pointed away from accident. Stan Baxter was the one who stumbled onto it. Back here, Inspector, he called, his tone uneasy. Jessica followed with Lady Bantry at her side, the two women stepping into the cramped scullery behind the main shop. It was utilitarian, shelves lined with empty vases, spare buckets, boxes of ribbon. Nothing extraordinary at first glance. But Stan pointed toward a shallow metal dish on a low shelf. Jessica leaned in. The bottom was coated with a yellowish residue. She didn't touch it, but the faint acrid smell rising from it told her what it was before anyone else spoke. Burnt sulfur, she said softly. Lady Bantry wrinkled her nose. Is that what I'm smelling? It's dreadful. Inspector Slack crouched beside the pan, scratching at the residue with his pencil. Sulfur. And in a flower shop. Dr. Haydock, who had been brought in again at Slack's request, joined them. He bent over, sniffed, and gave a short nod. Sulfur residue, yes. Likely from a candle. Garden fumigation. But in a closed space, he stopped, giving Jessica a knowing glance. Jessica finished the thought. In a closed space, fumes like that could trigger a respiratory collapse. And Felix Hartley had a history of chest trouble. On cue, Slack pulled open the rubbish sack by the scullery door. Inside lay an empty tin labeled sulfur candles, for greenhouse use. He turned it toward the group, his expression grim. Ivy Pritchard, hovering near the doorway, raised her voice sharply. That is not for my shop. I've never used sulfur fumigation here. Never. Nell looked startled. But Aunt Ivy, remember? Stan cleared out the old storage shed last week. Stan nodded eagerly, relieved at the reminder. Yes, ma'am. I found a few old tins when I was sorting rubbish. Tossed them out, just like you said. Jessica studied their faces, weighing the truth. Stan looked earnest, and Nell sounded uncertain but honest. Ivy, however, was rigid, her professional pride flaring at the mere suggestion her flowers had been tainted. Jessica's eyes swept the room. A bucket in the corner had been rinsed hastily, the sink still damp, mineral streaks staining the porcelain. And the floor near the pan had a fresh, uneven shine, as though someone had mopped it quickly, not thoroughly. Inspector, Jessica said, her voice thoughtful, someone tried to erase traces of what they'd done. But sulfur has a way of leaving behind its story. Slack grunted. So someone lit a candle in here, produced gas, and then what, piped it into the cold room? Jessica didn't answer immediately. She looked again at the scattered roses on the worktable. Bronze-tipped petals. An impossible door latch. A bent card. Now sulfur. Each thread wove itself into a tighter web. The candle wasn't an accident, she said finally. It was lit with intent. And the smell of matches, she gestured toward the scullery, tells us it was recent. Lady Bantry pressed a gloved hand to her chest. So you believe Felix Hartley was murdered? Jessica didn't flinch from the word. Yes, she said simply. And someone went to a great deal of trouble to make it look like fate. The sulfur residue clung faintly to the air, sharp and accusing. To Jessica, it was the scent of premeditation. Chapter 6, Green Tape on the Alley Cobbles. The discovery of the sulfur residue had sharpened the investigation. Inspector Slack no longer muttered about heart attacks and bad luck. His men began combing the alley behind Pritchard and Posey, and Jessica slipped on her coat to follow. The alley was narrow, paved with cobbles polished smooth by a century of cart wheels. It smelled faintly of damp stone and cut stems tossed from the flower shop. Mrs. Fletcher, Slack called from a crouched position near the High Street end. He lifted something between two stubby fingers. See this? Jessica bent closer. It was a strip of green florist's tape, torn rather than cut, its sticky side still dusted with grit from the cobbles. That isn't litter, Jessica said quietly. It's too specific. Slack nodded. Could have been dropped during deliveries. Jessica's eyes drifted to Stan, who was shifting nervously beside his bicycle. Stan, let me see your roll of tape. He produced it from his handlebar basket, the roll clean and intact. I haven't used a bit today, Mrs. Fletcher. Not one strip. Nell, still pale from the day's shocks, spoke up. I cut mine with scissors at the counter. I never tear tape like that. Jessica studied the torn edge. This wasn't cut carefully. It was yanked in haste. She let the tape dangle in the sunlight, its green sheen catching her eye. Tape like this had strength, pliability, and grip. Enough to bind flowers together, or perhaps to serve another purpose entirely. Lady Bantry, watching Jessica's expression, asked quietly, You believe it was used for the latch, don't you? Jessica didn't give her a direct answer. Instead, she walked back toward the cold room door inside the shop. She crouched, running a fingertip along the bottom edge where the door sealed against the floor. There, in the faint dust, ran a thin groove, like something had been dragged beneath it. Inspector, Jessica said softly, imagine threading something flexible under here. Something with enough grip to pull or press the latch. Slack crouched beside her, following the line with his eyes. So you're saying the latch could have been worked from outside, with tape? It would take patience, Jessica admitted. And a tool. But it's possible. And this strip of tape out on the cobbles looks very much like evidence that someone disposed of their materials quickly on the way out. Dr. Haydock, who had remained in the background, finally spoke. And if that's true, then Felix Hartley didn't just collapse. He was locked in. Intentionally. Jessica straightened, folding her arms. That's what it's beginning to look like. The alley behind the shop was quiet, the village high street still buzzing with normal life just beyond. But on those cobblestones lay a torn piece of tape that whispered of deliberate hands, hasty movements, and a trap set with chilling precision. Jessica's novelist's instinct told her one thing with absolute certainty: whoever had killed Felix Hartley hadn't just known the shop's routines. They had been confident enough to turn its very tools into weapons. And confidence like that always had a reason. Chapter 7, The Thermostat Set for November. The investigation had already turned strange: sulfur on the petals, tape on the cobbles, a bent florist's card. But Jessica Fletcher wasn't satisfied yet. Something about the cold room itself kept tugging at her mind. She stepped back into the humming chamber, the air sharp with the perfume of roses. Inspector Slack trailed after her, notebook in hand, wary but curious. "What are you after now, Mrs. Fletcher?" he asked. Jessica's eyes had gone to the brass thermostat mounted near the door. The dial was set far lower than springtime flowers would ever need. "This," she said simply, pointing. "The temperature's set for November storage, not May." Slack frowned. "Meaning what?" Jessica adjusted her glasses. "Meaning the cooling unit would have run constantly. The fan would have circulated the air much more aggressively than usual." She let the thought hang. It was Dr. Haydock who filled in the silence. And if sulfur fumes were introduced into that environment, they'd disperse evenly, fast. No pocket of safety, no corner to retreat to. Anyone inside would breathe it full in. Slack's jaw tightened. So the thermostat wasn't just careless. It was part of the plan. Jessica nodded. "It suggests someone not only knew about the cold room but also how to manipulate it. That's not casual knowledge." Lady Bantry, hovering at the doorway, spoke up. "But surely anyone in the village could have fiddled with a dial?" "Perhaps," Jessica said, "but not everyone would know what effect it would have in combination with sulfur. That points to someone who understands both mechanics and plants." She crouched, examining the dial more closely. A faint smear glistened against the brass faceplate, catching the light at just the right angle. Jessica touched it lightly with a tissue. It was silvery, greasy. "Inspector, take a look," she said. Slack rubbed at the mark with his thumb, then sniffed. "Polish. Silver polish." Jessica's gaze lifted toward Ursula Hartley, who had just entered with her handbag clutched tightly. She looked startled at the mention. "I was at the church this morning," Ursula said quickly. "Altar guild duty. Polishing communion vessels. Of course my gloves would have traces of it." Her explanation was smooth, plausible, and yet Jessica watched the way Ursula gripped her bag, knuckles pale. Guilt? Or merely nerves under suspicion? It was too soon to know. Stan, who had been silent until now, spoke up suddenly. "Mrs. Fletcher, I remember when I first came in this morning, the motor sounded odd. Like it was working twice as hard as usual." Jessica turned toward him. "That's important, Stan. It tells us the thermostat was tampered with before Felix ever set foot in here. Someone prepared this room well in advance." The pieces were beginning to line up with frightening clarity. The bent card suggested a tool had been hidden. The tape hinted at manipulation of the latch. The sulfur residue spoke of gas released with intent. And now the thermostat, deliberately set too low, ensured those fumes would blanket the entire chamber in minutes. Jessica folded her arms, her expression grim. This wasn't improvisation. It was a carefully staged trap. Someone didn't just want Felix Hartley uncomfortable. They wanted him helpless. She looked from Ursula, to Ivy, to Nell, to Stan, each face pale beneath the shop's warm lights. In the silence, Jessica felt it, the killer was in this very room. And every fresh clue was tightening the noose around them. Chapter 8, The Florist's Wire with Linen Fluff. By the time dusk began to edge over Much Benham, Inspector Slack had ordered every drawer, shelf, and counter in Pritchard and Posey examined. The shop no longer felt like a florist's, it felt like evidence waiting to speak. Jessica Fletcher stood near the main counter, watching as Slack's constable pulled out a drawer filled with florist's wire. Coils of different gauges lay neatly stacked, each compartment organized with Ivy Pritchard's typical precision. It was Jessica who noticed the oddity. Among the tidy rolls, one length of heavy-gauge wire had been bent into a sharp angle, its end jagged, as if shaped with purpose. She lifted it carefully. "Inspector," she said, holding it up. "This isn't a florist's bow wire. It's been fashioned into something else." Slack frowned, taking it from her. "Like what?" Jessica pointed to the hooked shape. "Strong enough to push or pull. Flexible enough to thread under a door. Just the sort of tool one might need to manipulate a latch from the outside." Something pale clung to the point. Jessica plucked it delicately between her fingers. A thread, white linen. Fabric, she murmured. Fresh. Torn. Lady Bantry leaned closer. Good heavens, Jessica, it looks like it snagged on clothing. Jessica crossed to Ivy, her eyes falling on the florist's apron tied tightly around her waist. The hem was frayed, one section tugged loose where a thread was missing. Jessica didn't accuse, but she held the wire near the apron quietly. The match was unmistakable. Ivy's face drained of color. That isn't mine. I've never bent wire like that. I wouldn't even know how. Jessica's voice was calm, measured. And yet here it is, bent into a hook and carrying a piece of your apron with it. The silence that followed was heavy. Nell's eyes darted nervously between her aunt and Jessica. Stan shifted, guiltless but anxious, as though just being present put him under suspicion. Mrs. Fletcher, Slack said, rubbing his chin, are you suggesting this wire was used to secure the door latch? Jessica didn't answer directly. Instead, she asked, Inspector, would you permit me a small demonstration? Slack hesitated, then gave a short nod. Jessica took the bent wire, knelt by the cold room door, and slid it beneath the gap. Her hands were steady, patient, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime sewing, typing, and repairing things herself. With careful pressure, she maneuvered the hook upward. A faint click echoed from the latch inside. She straightened. There. Secured from the outside. Slack let out a low whistle. Ingenious. And devilish. Jessica held up the wire again. See this sharp crease through the florist's card we found earlier? I believe it was folded around this wire to guide it under the door. The card was never just a note, it was part of the tool. Dr. Haydock gave a slow, solemn nod. That explains the strange crease. Jessica continued, her voice steady. The wire was withdrawn in a hurry, and it caught on something, the linen thread from Mrs. Pritchard's apron. Small details, but small details tell the truth. Ivy's protest came weakly. I never meant, she stopped, clutching the counter as though it might hold her up. Jessica didn't press further. She knew confessions came in their own time, and under their own weight. But the picture was sharpening now, the sulfur fumes, the altered thermostat, the latch manipulated from outside. The tools of a florist, wire, card, tape, turned into instruments of murder. And Jessica Fletcher knew the story wasn't about flowers anymore. It was about motive. Always motive. Chapter 9, The Rose That Drank a Copper Penny. The shop was quiet again, though the silence carried a different weight now. The constables had finished their search of the scullery, and Inspector Slack sat hunched over his notebook, chewing his pencil. Jessica Fletcher, meanwhile, returned to the cold room. Something about the scattered roses still pulled at her curiosity. Lady Bantry joined her, careful not to step on the damp floor where petals still clung. She looked over Jessica's shoulder, then gasped softly. Jessica, there's something odd in that bucket. Jessica crouched. At the bottom of the water, gleaming faintly, lay a single coin, a copper penny, old and dulled. She reached in with a handkerchief, lifting it into the light. Well, well, she murmured. Not the sort of thing you expect to find in a professional arrangement. Dr. Haydock, drawn over by their voices, peered at it. His medical background had given him a passing knowledge of old remedies, and recognition flickered immediately. A gardener's trick. Copper in the water slows bacterial growth, keeps roses fresher longer. My grandmother swore by it. Jessica nodded slowly. Yes, I've heard of it too. But commercial florists don't rely on pennies anymore. They use preservative sachets. Which means this penny wasn't part of standard practice, it was placed here deliberately. Ivy Pritchard's voice, tight with strain, came from the doorway. That isn't one of mine. We haven't used coins in arrangements for years. Not since preservatives became reliable. Nell looked surprised. I've never even seen Aunt Ivy use that method. Not once. Jessica studied Ivy carefully. The woman's denial sounded truthful, but there was more beneath it, something like recognition. Lady Bantry, her memory sparked, snapped her fingers. Ivy, I do remember. Years ago, when you first opened, you swore by pennies in water. You even told me so when you did my silver anniversary flowers. The words hit like a stone dropped into still water. Ivy's face betrayed the impact before she mastered it again. Jessica held up the penny, her tone thoughtful rather than accusing. Sometimes, under stress, people revert to old habits. Techniques they learned long ago. They don't even realize they're doing it. Slack scratched furiously in his notebook. So you're saying whoever staged those flowers after Hartley fell back on this penny trick. And the only one here known for it is Mrs. Pritchard. Jessica didn't confirm or deny, but her gaze stayed fixed on Ivy. The florist looked pale, cornered. The evidence was tightening now, the bent wire, the polished thermostat, the sulfur traces, the torn tape, and this coin from another era, all pointing in one direction. Jessica tucked the penny into a small envelope and handed it to Slack. Evidence isn't about what people say. It's about what they do without thinking. And this penny speaks volumes. She straightened, surveying the cold room one last time. The roses, so carefully bred for beauty, had become silent witnesses. Their petals bronzed, their stems scorched, and their water tainted with old secrets. Jessica knew the truth was nearly within reach. One final detail, one final misstep, and the picture would be complete. Chapter 10, Evensong and the Name Hidden by the Bouquet. By evening, Much Benham had lost its usual Saturday cheer. The church bells prepared to call the faithful to evensong, but the village itself seemed hushed, weighed down by what had unfolded inside the flower shop. Inspector Slack gathered everyone in the vicarage sitting room. Dr. Haydock sat near the fire, grave and tired. Lady Bantry perched in her usual chair, her sharp eyes never leaving Jessica Fletcher, who sat opposite, notebook in hand. Ivy Pritchard and her niece Nell sat side by side on the sofa, pale but composed. Ursula Hartley, stiff-backed and gloved, looked as though the scandal itself were a personal affront. Jessica set her notebook aside. Inspector, I think we now understand what happened to Felix Hartley. His death was no accident. It was the result of a carefully arranged plan. Slack gave a gruff nod. Go on, Mrs. Fletcher. Jessica folded her hands, her tone steady. First, the sulfur residue. A candle was lit in or near the cold room. Then the thermostat was deliberately lowered so that the fan would run continuously, ensuring the fumes spread quickly and evenly. Next, the latch. Someone fashioned a tool from florist's wire, guided it under the door with a folded card, and secured it from outside. When the wire was withdrawn, it caught on a linen apron, leaving behind its thread. And finally, the roses. Their petals bore the chemical scars, and a copper penny was found in the water bucket. An old trick for preservation, but one tied directly to the habits of someone in this room. Ivy closed her eyes briefly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jessica's voice softened. The plan was clever. It looked like a heart attack, brought on by a man with known health troubles. But details gave it away. The bronzed petals, the scrubbed floor, the card with codes overwritten, the tape discarded outside. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. All those little things, the things people overlook, pointed to murder. Dr. Haydock gave a slow, sorrowful nod. And the victim's condition made him especially vulnerable. Lady Bantry leaned forward. But Jessica, why? Why would anyone go to such lengths? Jessica turned to Ivy. That's the final piece. Motive. Felix Hartley had discovered irregularities in wartime supplies, old shortcuts and compromises Ivy had made to keep her shop alive during rationing. He threatened to expose them and take her lease unless she surrendered. To him, it was leverage. To Ivy, it was destruction. Ivy's composure cracked. Her voice came low, almost a whisper. He would have ruined everything. The shop, my reputation, the memory of my husband. I only wanted to frighten him, Jessica. Just to make him ill, to give him a taste of suffering. I never meant for it to end this way. Jessica's eyes held hers. There was compassion in them, but also truth. But you knew about his weak heart, Ivy. You knew sulfur fumes could be fatal. That wasn't a gamble. That was intent. Inspector Slack stood, his face grim. Mrs. Ivy Pritchard, I have no choice but to take you into custody. Nell began to cry softly, and Stan, standing helplessly by the door, moved closer to comfort her. Ursula Hartley gave a sharp sniff, as though satisfied to see the matter settled, though her own face looked drawn. Jessica watched as Ivy rose, her dignity flickering even under the weight of despair. The constable led her out quietly, the room heavy with silence. Later, in Lady Bantry's drawing room, Jessica trimmed the bruised edge of a rose and slipped the copper penny back into its water. A small act of preservation, symbolic if nothing else. Lady Bantry shivered. A flower shop meant for joy, and instead. Jessica finished the thought gently. Beauty doesn't erase the shadows behind it. People reveal themselves in the smallest ways, a bent card, a folded wire, a habit they can't leave behind. Murder, dressed up as misfortune, still leaves a trail. Outside, the bells of Much Benham began to toll, their notes rolling through the village with the old promise of peace. Jessica Fletcher closed her notebook. The case was finished. But the lesson, about desperation, habit, and the danger of silence, would remain.